For 18 years, a Native American woman lived on an island barely 60 miles off the coast of Southern California. She made her own clothes, built shelters from whale bones and branches, stored food, and carried water in baskets. She waterproofed herself. When hunters finally found her, they did not find a woman barely clinging to life. They found someone running a small world of her own. And the strangest part of her story was waiting not on the island, but back in California. There is one problem right at the beginning. We do not know her real name. Juana Maria is the name she received shortly before her death, when a Catholic priest conditionally baptized her in Santa Barbara. The name her parents gave her, the name her children may have used, the name someone once called across a beach on San Nicolas Island. All of that disappeared with the world she came from. It is an appropriate beginning for a story where almost every simple answer turns out to be less simple than it first appears. In the summer of 1853, sea otter hunter George Nidever sailed towards San Nicolas Island. By then, stories about a woman living there had been circulating along the California coast for years. Earlier visitors had reported signs of human activity, and at one point, there were even efforts and rewards connected with finding her. Nidever was not sailing toward a completely unknown mystery. He was sailing toward a person who had already started becoming a legend before anyone could ask her what had actually happened. His men went ashore and began searching. They found bare human footprints in the sand, along with smaller tracks from dogs, and followed the signs inland. Eventually, they reached a small settlement that did not look like the desperate camp of someone surviving from one meal to the next. The woman was near a shelter made from branches and whale bones. Strips of meat were drying nearby. She had stone and bone tools, baskets, stored food, clothing she had made herself, and places where useful materials were kept. When several armed and bearded strangers suddenly appeared in front of her, she did not scream and run toward the hills. According to the men who later described the meeting, she smiled. That detail matters. The easy version of this story is about a woman slowly turning wild while waiting 18 years for civilization to rescue her. The people who actually met her described almost the opposite. She was active, physically capable, curious, and apparently comfortable in a place where most modern Americans would start looking for the emergency satellite phone before sunset. Nidever remembered a woman of medium height and solid build, probably somewhere around middle age. Her dark hair had been bleached and tangled by years of sun, salt, and wind. Her clothing was made from bird skins, with greenish feathers still attached. Her teeth were badly worn, something that is not difficult to imagine after years of eating tough, dried foods and working with materials that came directly from the sea. She offered the newcomers food and communicated with her hands and face. There was no dramatic collapse at the sight of rescuers. The men had walked into her home, and for the first few minutes, the person who understood everything around them was not the armed hunter. It was her. To understand why she could survive there, San Nicolas itself has to be cleared of one very persistent image. This is not a tropical island with palm trees, sweet water running through a green valley, and coconuts politely falling next to the front door. San Nicolas is one of the Southern California Channel Islands, a long, low piece of land exposed to the Pacific, with dunes, sandstone, scrub, fog, strong wind, sea mammals, seabirds, and very little of what a modern person would call convenient. There are no forests to disappear into. Fresh water is limited. The weather can be damp and cold, especially when the wind has been working on you for several hours. Fog can erase the horizon, and sand can move far enough over time to bury places that once looked permanent. If someone handed you the keys to this island today and told you the mortgage was fully paid, you might still ask where the nearest grocery store was. The answer would be roughly 60 miles across the ocean. Yet people had lived on San Nicolas for thousands of years. Long before California had highways, missions, Spanish ranchos, Los Angeles traffic, or anyone arguing about parking in Santa Barbara, native communities had already learned how to make this island work. They understood where water could be found, when fish and marine mammals were available, which plants were useful, how to handle the wind, and how to turn almost everything on the shoreline into either food, clothing, tools, or building material. Today, these island people are usually called the Nicolanos, after San Nicolas Island. We do not know with certainty what they called themselves. Their language and culture were connected to the indigenous world of Southern California and the neighboring islands. They traveled by water, traded, fished, collected shellfish, hunted, and worked materials that a hardware store would never think to put in the same aisle. One of the most important materials was abalone shell. From the outside, abalone looks like a rough chunk of marine armor. Inside, it shines with layers of blue, green, pink, and silver. Nicoleno craftspeople shaped it into fish hooks, ornaments, containers, and other objects. Something washed up by the Pacific could become jewelry in one pair of hands, and fishing equipment in another. Another useful material arrived from below the ocean floor. Natural petroleum seeps occur along the Southern California coast, and sticky asphaltum can wash ashore. To a beachgoer, it is the black mess that ruins a shoe. To an island craftsperson, it is waterproofing material. That mattered because water had to be collected and carried. The woman made tightly woven baskets and containers from island plants, and coating parts of them with asphaltum could make them much better at holding liquid. She was essentially building lightweight water containers from grass and natural tar, which is a useful reminder that technology does not have to involve metal, electricity, or something with a warranty. Her survival was not a miracle based on luck. It was knowledge, and that knowledge had already survived something far more destructive than bad weather. By the early 19th century, sea otter fur had become one of the most valuable products on the Pacific coast. The animal looks almost comically harmless while floating on its back, but its coat contains an extraordinary density of fur. That made a sea otter skin highly valuable in international trade. The business connected Alaska, California, Russia, China, Britain, the United States, and native communities that often had very little control over the system being built around them. Russian traders pushed south after otter populations in northern waters declined. The Russian-American company used Alaska native hunters because they were exceptionally skilled at hunting marine mammals from small boats. In 1814, the Russian-American company sent an Alaska native hunting crew to San Nicolas under Russian overseer Yakov Babin. The goal was straightforward: kill sea otters, collect valuable skins, and make money from an animal that had lived beside the Nicoleños long before anyone in a distant office decided its fur was a commercial opportunity. Something went badly wrong. Russian company documents written several years later describe a violent conflict. A Nicoleno group apparently killed one Alaska native hunter. The remaining hunters retaliated and killed many Nicoleños. The surviving documents do not tell us exactly how many people died, which is important because later retellings often produce neat percentages that the historical record cannot actually support. The company itself treated the event seriously. Russian officials held Babin responsible for the behavior of the hunting group and ordered him sent north, with the expectation that he would eventually answer questions before company authorities. Even people inside the fur operation understood that something on San Nicolas had crossed a line. For the island community, paperwork in Russian offices came too late. The population had been devastated. Disease, disruption, outside contact, and the growing pressure of the 19th century continued doing the rest. A community that had lived on the island for generations was reduced to a small number of survivors. Then, in 1835, another ship appeared. Its name almost sounds invented for a dark comedy: Peor es nada. In Spanish, the expression means roughly, better than nothing. The small Mexican schooner went to San Nicolas to remove the remaining Nicoleños and take them to mainland California. Historical researcher Susan Morris has pointed out an important limitation. We do not have the actual ship log that would settle every detail of the voyage. Much of what we know comes from later testimony, church records, and documents that have to be fitted together like pieces from several different boxes. According to the account George Nidever later recorded after speaking with participant Isaac Sparks, about 17 or 18 men, women, and children were taken from the island. The schooner eventually reached San Pedro, the harbor south of the small settlement of Los Angeles. From there, the Nicoleños entered a completely different world. One woman did not go with them. That much is real. Why she remained is where history starts growing branches. The simplest version is human carelessness. A storm was approaching, people were being collected quickly, and nobody had an exact passenger manifest with neat check marks beside every name. The schooner left before one woman was aboard. No villain is required. A rushed departure and a bad head count are enough. There is something almost insulting about that explanation, because the consequence is so enormous. 18 years can begin with the 19th century equivalent of someone assuming another person already checked the back room. The second version became the famous one. The woman had reached the ship, realized that a child had been left behind, then jumped into the water and returned to the island. In different retellings, the missing child became a brother, a daughter, or a son. It is a perfect story. That should immediately make us suspicious. Versions involving the dramatic leap into the sea became increasingly elaborate in later 19th century writing. Once the woman became a public legend, storytellers gave the event everything a Victorian audience could want: storm, motherly devotion, dangerous water, a ship disappearing into the distance. If someone had added violin music, the package would have been complete. The problem is not that the entire idea must be false. The problem is that later storytelling and early evidence became mixed together so thoroughly that certainty is impossible. Then, historians found a third version. Ethnographer John Peabody Harrington spent decades recording information from native Californians during the early 20th century. His notes preserve names, stories, language fragments, memories, and oral histories that might otherwise have disappeared. Researchers returned to this enormous archive and found evidence that changed the lone woman's story. According to native oral histories preserved through Harrington informants, the woman was not alone when the others departed in 1835. Her son remained on San Nicolas. She stayed for him. That changes almost everything. If the account is correct, she was not simply a forgotten passenger standing helplessly on a beach. She made a decision not to abandon her child. For some period of time, mother and son lived together on the island after the rest of the community had gone. The later tradition says the son eventually died in a boating accident. One family tradition preserved among Barbareño Chumash descendants describes a fishing accident involving a whale. Details differ, and we should not pretend that a story transmitted across generations works like a security camera. But modern National Park Service material now treats the evidence for a son seriously. So the famous 18 years of complete solitude may never have existed. There were 18 years between the departure of the Nicoleños and the woman leaving San Nicolas. That part is straightforward. How many of those years she spent completely alone is another question. After the death of her son, true isolation may have begun. It is tempting to imagine 18 years as one long, empty block of time. Real life does not work that way. A person does not wake every morning thinking, "Today is day 4,317 of my historic survival story." She wakes because something needs doing. Water has to be collected. Food has to be checked. A basket has to be repaired. A garment needs stitching. Meat must be dried before it spoils. Firewood has to be gathered in a place where large trees are not exactly volunteering for the job. The island did not give her a salary or retirement plan. It charged rent every morning. Her main food came from the sea. Seals and sea lions offered meat and fat. Fish and shellfish could be gathered from the coast. Seabirds provided meat, skins, feathers, and bone. Plant foods and roots added other resources. The woman dried meat on racks and stored food for later. Fat could be kept in prepared animal bladders. Bone became needles and other fine tools. Stone became cutting edges. Sinew became thread. Her clothing especially impressed the hunters who later described her. She wore a garment made from cormorant skins, sewn together with sinew, with some of the feathers left in place. On a windy Pacific island, that was not costume design, it was insulation. Her shelters were equally practical. Nidever and Carl Dittman described small structures made from branches and whale ribs. Imagine the curved rib of a large whale planted into sand like a structural beam. When timber is scarce and the Pacific delivers a giant bone to your front yard, there is no reason to argue with free building material. Nearby, meat dried on poles and ropes. Useful objects had assigned places. She had more than one shelter. This was not the temporary camp of someone expecting a rescue boat next Tuesday. It was a working household. Even her baskets reveal that. Witnesses and later researchers described several forms of weaving and containers designed for different jobs. That sounds like a minor detail until you compare it with a garage. Nobody who knows what they are doing owns one tool called the metal thing. There are wrenches, pliers, screwdrivers, saws, sockets, and at least one object nobody remembers buying but everyone refuses to throw away. Different baskets served different purposes because her material culture was specialized. The fact that she lacked iron did not mean she lacked engineering. This is where the word primitive becomes useless. A modern American dropped on San Nicolas with a pocket knife and a weekend cooler might have better manufactured equipment on the first morning. 6 months later, the comparison could look very different. Equipment runs out. Knowledge does not. The woman knew what the island could provide and what it could not. She knew how to manufacture replacements instead of waiting for a delivery truck that would never come. She knew how to store calories. She knew how to protect water. She knew how to turn a bird bone into a needle thin enough to sew clothing. Her isolation also may not have been as absolute as the legend suggests. Ships traveled through Southern California waters during those 18 years. Hunters, smugglers, traders, and other visitors used the Channel Islands. Records suggest that San Nicolas was not sitting inside some invisible bubble that no other human being penetrated between 1835 and 1853. That raises an uncomfortable question. If other people sometimes came near the island, why did she remain? We do not know. Maybe she never encountered them closely. Maybe some never realized she was there. Maybe opportunities to leave were far rarer than a modern map makes them look. There is another possibility that deserves to remain on the table. Perhaps she did not want to approach strangers. Think about what ships represented in the history she knew. Outsiders had come for sea otters, and a massacre followed. Another outside vessel had taken away almost everyone she knew. Her son, according to the later account, died after she chose to remain with him. From our perspective, a sail on the horizon means rescue. From hers, it may have meant trouble with a mast. The language of rescue can become misleading when the person being rescued has not told us she wants what we are offering. Her island was difficult. It was also familiar. The mainland was neither. There was another reason nobody quickly returned after the 1835 removal. The schooner, Better Than Nothing, did not have a long career. Later accounts say Captain Charles Hubbard expected to return, but the vessel was soon lost near the entrance to San Francisco Bay after striking heavy floating timber. The irony is so complete that improving it would only make it worse. A ship called Better Than Nothing removes a people from their island, leaves a woman behind, and then disappears itself. Other vessels existed, of course. California had not run out of wood and sails, but organizing a voyage meant money, crew, supplies, weather, and a reason someone with resources considered important enough to act on. One isolated native woman did not immediately rise to the top of that list. Years passed, stories spread, attempts to find her were made, and some failed. Eventually, George Nidever decided to try. By the time his party reached San Nicolas in 1853, California itself had changed dramatically. The United States had taken control of California after the war with Mexico. Gold had transformed San Francisco. Los Angeles was growing. The American West was filling with migrants, merchants, ranchers, sailors, soldiers, prospectors, and officials. And 60 miles offshore, one woman was still living largely by the technology of the world into which she had been born. After finding her, the hunters did something that sounds strange if we keep using the word rescue. They initially took her to a boat anchored offshore because they were afraid she might run away. That comes from the accounts reconstructed by retired United States Navy archaeologist Steve Schwartz. After about a day, the men became satisfied that she was not trying to escape. They took her back to their camp. Then they went back to hunting sea otters. The woman remained with them for about a month. This is much better than the movie version because it is so ordinary. The Great Rescue did not consist of a swelling orchestra and immediate departure toward civilization. The men still had work to finish. She helped around the camp. She collected wood and water. She wove baskets. She adapted to the new group in the same practical way she had adapted to life alone. For about a month, this strange, temporary household existed on San Nicolas. Hunters went out after otters. The woman who had been the subject of coastal rumors lived beside them. Nobody could interview her for a newspaper. Nobody had a camera pointed at her face. Life simply continued. Then Nidever sailed for Santa Barbara with her aboard. The trip itself included bad weather. The vessel took shelter near Santa Cruz Island before continuing. On September 1st, 1853, the woman reached Santa Barbara. Her world changed in a few hours. One of the first things that astonished her was a horse. That detail appears in later accounts, and it is easy to understand why it survived. Imagine spending years surrounded by seals, birds, dogs, fish, and marine mammals, then seeing a full-grown horse carrying a human being. To the people on shore, it was transportation. To her, it was something new enough to stop and study. She went to the adobe home of George Nidever and his family. The household primarily spoke Spanish. Visitors began arriving almost immediately. The lone woman had become news. People wanted to see her. Priests visited. Native Californians came and tried to communicate. Curious residents brought food and gifts. Accounts describe her as cheerful, interested in what she saw, and willing to sing and dance for visitors. This part of the story is often treated as a happy ending. It lasted 7 weeks. Before getting there, something else happened that tells us quite a lot about 19th century America. According to later accounts, a sea captain offered Nidover a large amount of money, reportedly $1,000, for the right to take the woman to San Francisco and exhibit her to paying crowds. $1,000 in 1853 was not pocket change. Nidover refused. Still, the offer is revealing. A woman spends years preserving herself, her skills, and fragments of her culture on a remote island. She reaches mainland California, and almost immediately someone sees a business model. The American entertainment industry was apparently prepared for reality television long before television. Communication became the next problem. The standard version says nobody could understand a word she spoke. Chumash people tried. Gabrielino people tried. Others familiar with Southern California native languages tried. According to Nidover and Dittman, communication happened mostly through gestures. The burial registry later stated that nobody understood her language. This became one of the most haunting lines in the entire story. She had survived long enough to come back to a world filled with people, and then discovered that nobody could enter her language. Modern research complicated that story too. Harrington informant Fernando Librado remembered a Fernandeño man named Norberto. Norberto was a shoemaker and saddle maker in Santa Barbara. According to Librado, Norberto could speak freely with the lone woman. That is a very different picture. Instead of an absolutely sealed language barrier, we may have had partial communication through related Southern California languages, with at least one person capable of much more. A National Park Service research panel later argued that native speakers in Santa Barbara could communicate with her well enough for her to explain why she had remained on San Nicolas. The official church entry and the later native oral history do not fit neatly together. Good. History often does not. One possibility is that the priest who wrote the burial record meant nobody present could understand her well enough for formal religious instruction. Another is that communication was partial and uneven. Another is that later memories exaggerated what Norberto understood. We cannot make the contradiction disappear simply because a clean story would be easier to narrate. What we can say is that the old claim of total incomprehension is no longer the only serious version. Very little of her language survived in written form. A few words were recorded by people trying to reproduce unfamiliar sounds with an alphabet not designed for the job. Later linguists compared those fragments with languages of Southern California and placed Nicoleno within the larger Uto-Aztecan language family. 4 words are not much of a dictionary. It gets worse. Even the meanings attached to some of those words are uncertain. When a language is disappearing while people are still trying to figure out what they are hearing, mistakes multiply quickly. Imagine trying to reconstruct modern English 200 years from now from 4 words somebody heard through a wall. There is also a song, and the song has made an extraordinary trip through time. A Chumash man named Melquiades Maria was associated with the party that found the lone woman. According to Fernando Librado, Melquiades heard her sing and remembered one of her songs. Librado later learned it from him. In 1913, ethnographer John Peabody Harrington recorded Librado singing it onto a wax cylinder. So the recording that survives is not the lone woman. It is the voice of a man singing a song he learned from another man, who had heard the woman herself decades earlier. That may sound disappointing until you consider the alternative. Without that chain, there would be nothing. A woman sings on an island in the 1850s. Another person remembers. The memory passes to somebody else. A needle cuts vibration into wax 60 years later. More than a century after that, people can still listen to the melody through digital equipment. Almost everything physical around the original performance disappeared. The sound found a way through. Translations attached to the song are much less secure. Some versions interpret it as expressing mixed feelings about leaving the island and returning to human company. Other, more poetic translations go further. The National Park Service is careful about the meaning because the linguistic chain is too fragile to support certainty. That caution makes the song more interesting, not less. We can hear it. We just cannot be sure what she was saying. During her weeks in Santa Barbara, the woman ate foods that had been absent from her diet for years. Accounts describe visitors bringing produce and other unfamiliar items. She encountered domestic animals, houses, streets, crowds, and a household routine completely unlike the one she had built on San Nicolas. She seemed fascinated rather than terrified. Then, she became sick. On October 19, 1853, Only about 7 weeks after arriving in Santa Barbara, she was near death. At the request of Maria Sinforosa Nidover, a priest conditionally baptized her. The priest gave her the name Juana Maria. She died soon afterward. The burial record places her at Mission Santa Barbara. The exact location of her grave has never been securely identified. A memorial plaque was added much later, but the woman herself lies somewhere in ground where many native people were buried without permanent individual markers. The person who survived years of storms, hunger risks, injuries, cold, and isolation died inside a California town. That creates an irresistible question. What killed her? Dysentery appears in historical accounts, but the exact medical chain is uncertain. Modern National Park Service material lists several possibilities, including contaminated food, a sudden change in diet, exposure to disease, and injury. The disease explanation is easy to understand. Long isolation can reduce exposure to pathogens circulating in larger populations. Native communities across the Americas had already suffered catastrophic epidemics after the arrival of diseases from Europe and other parts of the world. But we should not turn that general truth into a laboratory diagnosis for one woman. Nobody took a modern blood panel in 1853. The food explanation is equally tempting. For years, her body had been adapted to a diet heavy in marine foods and whatever plants the island supplied. Suddenly, people were offering fruits, vegetables, grains, domestic meat, and other foods from mainland kitchens. The human digestive system includes an enormous microbial community that responds to diet. A dramatic dietary change can cause problems. Contaminated food can cause much worse ones. Still, the popular idea that kind neighbors accidentally killed her simply by giving her fruit is too neat. Reality does not owe us that kind of symbolism. Her death may have involved infection, diet, physical stress, injury, or several factors acting together. We know the result. We do not know every mechanism. The contrast remains brutal enough without decorating it. San Nicolas looked deadly and kept her alive. Santa Barbara looked safe, and she was dead in 7 weeks. Afterward, newspapers and storytellers began finishing the story for her. She became the last woman of a vanished people, the last Nicoleno, the final speaker of a dead language. This is the version that has emotional symmetry. Everyone else leaves. One person survives. She returns. Then she dies, and an entire culture closes like a book. California has produced more than one story like this. Decades later, Ishi would be presented to the American public as the last of the Yahi. Scholars of native California have pointed out how powerful the idea of the last Indian became in American culture. There is a problem with that language. People rarely vanish as neatly as the label last suggests. Sometimes, descendants survive through other family lines. Sometimes communities merge. Sometimes the records are wrong. Sometimes officials do not know where people went. Sometimes a person declared culturally alone has relatives or members of the same community living within traveling distance. That is exactly what happened here. The Nicolenos removed from San Nicolas in 1835 were taken to San Pedro and then into the Los Angeles region. For a long time, writers repeated the claim that they quickly died and disappeared. Historical researcher Susan Morris and other scholars went into baptismal registers, census records, Mexican-era documents, American records, and church archives. People started coming back out of the paper. Records show Nicoleños baptized in Los Angeles in the 1830s. 2 women recorded as island Indians were very likely from San Nicolas. A newborn girl had parents identified as island Indians at a time when the other southern Channel Islands no longer had native populations living there in the old way. Then there was a boy. He was about 5 years old when he was baptized in December of 1835. He received the name Tomas Guadalupe. Tomas lived with the family of his godmother. He grew up. That sentence alone breaks the old story. He did not disappear within a few months. Mexican and American census records indicate that he survived until at least 1860. In that year, he married a young woman named Refugio Lopez, and in 1853, while the lone woman was living in Santa Barbara and people were trying to understand where she came from, Tomas Guadalupe was living on Spring Street in Los Angeles. Spring Street, not an unknown valley, not a village hidden somewhere beyond the Sierra Nevada. Los Angeles. The woman was in Santa Barbara. A man taken from her island as a 5-year-old boy was in Los Angeles. The distance between them was roughly 100 miles by land, depending on the route. Today, Someone in Southern California can drive farther than that because a restaurant had good reviews. In 1853, it was a serious trip. Roads were rough. Travel was slower. Messages did not move at phone speed. But Los Angeles and Santa Barbara were not separate planets. People traveled between them. Mail moved. Merchants traveled. Priests traveled. Officials traveled. The lone woman lived for 7 weeks after reaching Santa Barbara. There was time. What was missing was information. Nobody in the night of her house knew that somewhere on Spring Street lived a man who had boarded better than nothing as a little boy, 18 years earlier. Tomas probably did not know a woman from San Nicolas had suddenly appeared in Santa Barbara. Two parts of the same broken community existed in Southern California at the same time. They never met. Could Tomas still have spoken Nicoleno fluently after leaving the island at 5 years old and growing up in Los Angeles? We do not know. Could he have remembered the woman? We do not know. Was she related to him? We do not know. That is precisely why the detail hurts. There was a possibility. Maybe he remembered only a few words. Maybe he had forgotten almost everything. Maybe Norberto actually understood her better than Tomas would have. But Tomas carried something nobody else in Santa Barbara could manufacture: childhood on San Nicolas. He had seen the same coastline. He had heard the same language. He had known people from the same tiny community before the ship came. One familiar word might have changed those final weeks. Not because it would have cured dysentery, because it would have told her that the world she came from had not disappeared as completely as everyone assumed. The title of Last Nicoleno becomes even less secure when the other Los Angeles records are added. The people from San Nicolas did not simply evaporate the moment they stepped off the schooner. Some died quickly, some lived longer. At least one reached adulthood. The history had not vanished. It had been filed somewhere else. There is an almost absurd lesson in that. Sometimes a person does not disappear because a storm destroyed the evidence. Sometimes two clerks simply keep different books. After Juana Maria died, even the objects connected to her began disappearing. Her baskets, tools, clothing, needles, and other items were scattered among private collections and institutions. Some material associated with her eventually went to San Francisco. The earthquake and fires of 1906 destroyed enormous parts of the city and museum collections. Objects that had survived Pacific storms and years on San Nicolas could not survive modern urban fire. Her famous cormorant garment developed its own mystery. Some accounts place it among materials lost in California. Others say it may have been sent to Rome. If it reached Rome, its trail disappears. No catalog has produced a universally accepted answer. So add another item to the list. Real name unknown. Language nearly gone. Exact grave uncertain. Clothing missing. Personal belongings scattered or destroyed. A person can survive 18 years alone and still lose almost everything after rejoining society. The island itself remained. During the 20th century, San Nicolas became a United States Navy installation and testing range. Civilian access became tightly restricted. That had a strange side effect. The place where the lone woman story began remained geographically close to millions of Californians and psychologically very far away. People could read Island of the Blue Dolphins in a classroom in Los Angeles, while the real island sat offshore behind military restrictions. Scott Odell published the novel in 1960. His heroine, Karana, was inspired by the lone woman, but the book is historical fiction, not a transcript of her life. The novel became one of the best-known American children's survival stories and won the Newbery Medal. For generations of American students, Karana became more familiar than the real woman whose birth name nobody had preserved. That creates a peculiar reversal. The fictional girl has a name. The real woman does not. The fictional girl has clear motives. The real woman leaves us competing versions. The fictional story can tell us exactly what the heroine thought. History cannot. This is why returning to the island mattered. In 1939, archaeologist Arthur Woodward went to San Nicolas, carrying copies of the old descriptions from Nidover and Dittman. On the northwestern part of the island, he found scattered whale bones in an area matching the accounts of the shelter. The following year, he returned. Woodward stood some of the whale ribs upright and reconstructed part of a windbreak. He photographed an assistant sitting inside it. That photograph later began appearing in publications, as though someone had photographed the actual home exactly as the lone woman left it. They had not. It was a reconstruction based on a real site. That distinction may sound fussy, but it is the entire problem with this story in miniature. A real piece of evidence appears. Someone fills the missing space. A later audience forgets which part was evidence and which part was reconstruction. The cave was even more difficult. Early accounts said the woman used a cave near the area where she had been found. Later visitors reported entering such a cave and removing objects. Then the location was lost. San Nicolas had been heavily altered by grazing animals, especially sheep. Vegetation disappeared from some areas. Sand moved. Entrances were buried. Steve Schwartz spent more than 20 years looking for the cave during his career as a United States Navy archaeologist on San Nicolas. He nearly gave up. Then an old map helped. A coastal survey from 1879 marked an Indian cave. Field notes associated with the survey gave enough information to narrow down the location. The problem was that the Pacific had already hired a construction crew. Its name was Sand. Students from California State University, Los Angeles began digging. They removed roughly 40,000 5-gallon buckets of sand. Think about that the next time a home improvement project requires 3 trips to the hardware store. 40,000 buckets. Eventually, the opening appeared. Behind it was a huge dry cave, the largest known dry cave on San Nicolas. It extended deep into the sandstone and offered enough protected space for a substantial group of people. Was it the Lone Woman Cave? Possibly. Was it used by her people? Very likely. Can anyone prove she personally slept in one specific place inside it? No. That difference matters. A cave can belong to the history of a community without becoming the bedroom of the most famous person associated with that community. Around the same period, another archaeological discovery emerged from an eroding cliff. A whale rib was sticking out near 2 old redwood boxes. Inside and around them were more than 200 objects. The collection was extraordinary because it brought several worlds together in one place. There were objects associated with Nicoleno manufacture, items linked with Alaska Native technology, and European or American materials. There were fishing tools, bone objects, shell artifacts, pieces of glass that had been reshaped into cutting or projectile tools, and woven water containers coated with asphaltum. One group of objects was stored inside an abalone shell container, with another shell used as a kind of cover. It looked less like ceremonial treasure and more like a carefully stored working kit. Somebody expected those things to remain useful. That may be the most human part of the cache. Treasure is what outsiders call objects after the owner is gone. The owner may have simply thought, "I will need this later." Researchers have discussed whether the cache could be connected to the lone woman or to people close to her. Again, the responsible answer is possible, not proven. The dating and archaeological context are complicated. San Nicolas had been occupied by native people for an immense period. Alaska Native hunters had also spent time there. European and American goods circulated through the island. A mixed cache is exactly what we should expect from a place where those worlds collided. And yet, there is something almost impossible to ignore when looking at the objects. The woman survived by doing exactly what the cache represents. She reused, she adapted, she combined old island skills with whatever material became available. A piece of foreign glass did not remain foreign for long. Put it in skilled hands, and it became another tool. That is survival without the mythology. No inspirational speech, no heroic soundtrack, just material, knowledge, and work. Archaeological investigation on San Nicolas eventually ran into another issue. The island is an active military installation, and discoveries also fall under laws and responsibilities involving Native American cultural heritage. Excavation of the cave was halted. Native communities with cultural connections to the region raised concerns about further disturbance and the handling of archaeological material. The Navy complied with restrictions, and the work did not simply continue because researchers wanted to know what was inside. That leaves the story in an unusual state. The cave exists. Researchers found it. They still cannot excavate every answer they want. For anyone raised on television archaeology, this can feel frustrating. Find the mystery. Dig the mystery, solve the mystery. Real archaeology has other people involved. Some objects are not clues placed in the ground for our entertainment. They are cultural property, ancestral material, and sometimes parts of places that living communities do not want treated like an open toolbox. San Nicolas still holds unanswered questions. That is not a failure. It is the condition of the evidence. The same is true of the woman herself. Was she accidentally forgotten in 1835? Possible. Did she jump from the departing ship? Possible, but the dramatic versions became more elaborate over time. Did she stay because her son remained? Modern research gives that version significant support. How long did the son live? Uncertain. How many years was she truly alone? Uncertain. Did passing sailors ever meet her during those years? We do not know enough. Did she want to leave before night ever arrived? Unknown. Was Norberto really able to converse with her freely? A native oral tradition says yes. The burial record suggests a much stronger language barrier. Did Tomas Guadalupe still speak enough of the island language to communicate with her? We will probably never know. That is what makes the real story better than the clean version. The clean version is about survival. The real version is about survival, memory, colonial disruption, bad records, oral history, archaeology, lost language, accidental separation, and the astonishing ability of one human being to build a functioning life out of whatever the Pacific put within reach. It also forces us to reconsider what survival means. She did not survive because she conquered nature. That is a very American phrase, and it makes almost no sense here. You do not conquer the Pacific. You learn when not to argue with it. She survived because the island was not empty to her. Every shoreline had information. Every season meant something. Birds were not scenery. Whale bones were not museum objects. Asphaltum was not pollution. Shells were not souvenirs. That difference separates a person who is stranded from a person who is home. When Nidover and his crew arrived, they thought they had finally found a castaway. Maybe they had. They also found the last functioning household of a society that outsiders had already declared almost gone. Then they carried its owner into California. 7 weeks later, she was dead. For more than a century, the story ended there. The lone woman dies. The language dies. The Nicoleños disappear. Then a researcher opens an old church record in Los Angeles, and a boy appears. Tomas Guadalupe, 5 years old when baptized, still alive in 1853, living on Spring Street. A grown man while a woman from his island sat in a house in Santa Barbara, surrounded by strangers trying to understand her. That is the fact I cannot get past. Not because we know what would have happened if they met. We do not. Maybe they would have stared at one another and understood almost nothing. Maybe he had forgotten the language. Maybe she would not have recognized him. Maybe they had never known each other in the first place. Or maybe a sound from his mouth would have changed her face. A place name. A childhood word. A name she had not heard in years. Something ordinary. History tends to preserve wars, treaties, ships, governors, and dates because those things generate paperwork. What disappears first is usually the small stuff. How your mother called you inside for dinner. The word your people used for a certain bird. The joke everybody understood. The name of a beach. The sound of someone speaking without needing gestures. That was the world the lone woman had lost. And somewhere in Los Angeles, a man carried at least a fragment of the same world. They were not separated by the Pacific anymore. They were separated by information. That may be the cruelest part of the entire story. For 18 years, the ocean stood between her and California. When she finally crossed it, the person who might have understood something about where she came from was already on the same side. Nobody knew to bring them together.